In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great carved a new city into the Egyptian coastline. Alexandria was designed on a narrow delta, positioned as a geographic choke point for Mediterranean commerce and military transit. But just 9 years later, Alexander was dead. His sprawling empire violently fractured as his top generals fought to carve up the map for themselves. Ptolemy I Soter assumed control of Egypt. He minted his own face onto the local currency, but as a foreign Macedonian general, he lacked a historical or divine authority to rule the Egyptian populace. Physical occupation alone could not hold the territory. To secure a rule that lasted nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies needed to establish Alexandria as the cultural center of the Mediterranean. Ptolemy's first act of statecraft was the physical theft of Alexander the Great's funeral cortege. He diverted the conqueror's body from its intended path to Macedon and brought it back to Alexandria. By entombing Alexander inside the city limits, Ptolemy engineered a sacred dynastic link. The physical presence of the conqueror's remains projected an aura of legitimate succession onto the new king. Yet securing a dead body only established a claim to the past. It offered no mechanism for ruling in the centuries to follow. To permanently secure their empire and legitimize their dynasty, the Ptolemies had to collect every piece of writing within their palace walls. The kings recruited Demetrius of Phaleron, an exiled Athenian statesman, to design a centralized research institute. His blueprint was a state-funded campus known as the Mouseion. This complex was an enclosed ecosystem, featuring colonnaded walkways and a grand dining hall for the world's most influential scholars. The royal treasury covered every expense, providing free room, board, and tax exemptions, tying their research directly to the crown. This model co-opted the peripatetic philosophy of Aristotle, but centralized it. The Ptolemies pulled traditionally decentralized Greek intellectual power under a single royal patron. The Mouseion functioned as a state-controlled research hub, using royal stipends to bind the Mediterranean's greatest minds to the palace. The Ptolemies issued a mandate to acquire every known text in the world. Royal agents were deployed to book fairs across Athens and Rhodes with bottomless funds. In Alexandria, they instituted a maritime search policy. Every ship docking in the harbor surrendered any books on board for search and seizure. Scribes rapidly copied the confiscated texts. Copies returned to the ship owners, while the library claimed the originals. These specific stolen works were categorized and archived by the librarians under a unique tag, officially identifying them as from the ships. This procedural piracy funneled the world's knowledge through Alexandria, ensuring research passed a state-controlled filter. The most audacious acquisition occurred under Ptolemy III, who orchestrated a plan to acquire the official Athenian state archives. The king requested to borrow the irreplaceable manuscripts of the tragic poets, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, offering a security deposit of 15 talents of silver. Ptolemy intentionally forfeited the deposit. He locked away the originals, sending drafted copies to Athens. Holding a monopoly on original knowledge provided more leverage than raw economic wealth. Having secured dominance over Greek literature, the empire began targeting the foundational texts of foreign civilizations. The most significant project was the commissioning of the Septuagint. The Ptolemies ordered the translation of the Hebrew Torah into Greek, their administrative language. According to the letter of Aristeas, the king secured the cooperation of the high priest in Jerusalem, extracting 72 Jewish elders to travel to Alexandria. The translation process was tightly managed. The elders were secluded on the island of Pharos for 72 days of state-supervised labor. Rendering a foreign sacred text into the language of the court allowed the Ptolemies to integrate the Jewish religious identity into their own administrative framework. In the 3rd century BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty initiated a global sweep for information. They commanded ships entering Alexandria to surrender their texts, ultimately amassing hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls. But possessing 500,000 scrolls presents an immediate logistical nightmare. If researchers cannot locate a specific text within this sprawling physical inventory, the collection is effectively useless. Zenodotus, the first official head librarian, recognized the crisis. He began by physically separating the chaos, moving specific texts into designated rooms based on their broad subject matter. To navigate these rooms without unrolling every document, he invented the Silly Boy. These were simple parchment tags dangled from the end of each scroll, displaying the author and title. It was the ancient world's first physical metadata. A few decades later, a scholar named Callimachus of Cyrene scaled this concept up. He produced the Pinax, a sprawling 120-volume master catalog mapping the entirety of Greek literature. Callimachus transformed the inventory into an analytical tool. His 120 volumes alphabetized authors by genre, documented their biographies, and recorded exact line counts to verify the authenticity of every text. By imposing this strict structure onto a chaotic mountain of text, these early librarians established the foundational architecture for modern information retrieval. The scholars living and working inside the Mausean research complex were not gentle archivists. They were highly eccentric polymaths operating in a fiercely competitive environment. Their obsession with data frequently bordered on the pathological. A scholar named Didymus earned the nickname Bronze Guts by writing an estimated 4,000 books, a volume so massive he regularly forgot his own previously published conclusions. Intellectual disagreements routinely escalated into bitter personal feuds. Callimachus was so protective of his stylistic theories that his harsh criticism drove his own star pupil, Apollonius of Rhodes, into a self-imposed exile. This encyclopedic knowledge was actively weaponized. During a royal poetry contest, the librarian Aristophanes of Byzantium shocked the crowd by rejecting every single audience favorite, accusing the poets of theft. To prove his claim, Aristophanes relied on his photographic memory of the library's metadata. He marched into the stacks, retrieved the exact scrolls the contestants had lifted their verses from, and exposed the plagiarism on the spot. These scholars successfully mapped and conquered the written word, but their obsessive drive to classify information quickly spilled beyond the confines of the library walls. Having structured human language, the thinkers of Alexandria turned their rigorous methodology outward, attempting to classify the physical universe itself. Eratosthenes, the polymath relentlessly mocked by his peers as beta, or second best, silenced his detractors by measuring the difference in solar shadow angles at noon, accurately calculating the total circumference of the Earth. This geographical mapping relied heavily on the work of Euclid, who had recently laid out the absolute axiomatic rules of geometry in his treatise, The Elements. Here, Apollonius of Perga took those axioms further. By mathematically slicing a cone at different angles, he defined distinct curves: the ellipse, the parabola, and the hyperbola. These curves gave astronomers the exact mathematical vocabulary to track the elliptical trajectories of planets. Through geometry, they demonstrated that the physical world operates according to invisible, predictable, and measurable rules, rather than the random whims of gods. Building on this logic, Aristarchus of Samos attempted something seemingly impossible, calculating the physical distances between the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. This diagram shows his method. By waiting for the exact moment of a half moon, Aristarchus knew the Earth, Moon, and Sun formed a perfect right triangle. He then measured the angle from the Earth to the Sun at 87 degrees. Applying basic trigonometry to that angle, his calculations revealed that the Sun sat at a massive distance, roughly 20 times farther away from us than the Moon. He factored in shadow measurements taken during lunar eclipses, concluding that the Sun was also incredibly large, at least 6 to 7 times wider than the Earth. This data forced a profound deduction. Aristarchus reasoned it was physically illogical for a massive object like the Sun to orbit a tiny speck like the Earth. Relying purely on geometric logic, he broke the ancient illusion of human centrality, proposing the first known heliocentric model of the cosmos. The Alexandrian drive to map reality extended all the way from the vastness of the cosmos down into the intimate architecture of human anatomy. At the time, the internal mechanics of the body were a complete mystery, largely because human dissection was strictly forbidden by almost every culture in the ancient world. But the physicians Herophilus and Erasistratus took advantage of Egypt's long-standing local traditions surrounding mummification to bypass this global taboo and open the human machine. Through systematic dissection, they explored the hidden networks of the body. They were the first to identify the physical differences between blood vessels and the nervous system. By tracing those nerves upward, they made their most significant discovery. They proved that the brain, rather than the heart, acts as the true command center of human intelligence and sensation. Under the knives of these scholars, the body was stripped of its magical mystique and categorized as a complex, mapped mechanical system. The physical library at Alexandria did not survive. Centuries of sieges, fires, and urban neglect eventually reduced the buildings and their hundreds of thousands of scrolls to dust. Yet the loss of the papyrus is secondary to what was actually achieved there. The specific data burned, but the methodology used to organize it proved indestructible. In just a few centuries, these scholars established the protocols to categorize language, map the cosmos, and dissect human biology. Their compulsive need to classify and verify information laid the direct groundwork for the modern, data-driven architecture that currently dictates our world. The Mausians' enduring impact lies in the invention of the rational process we use to decode the universe, a methodology far more resilient than the library that housed it.
The popular memory of the Great Library of Alexandria is defined by a single catastrophe. We imagine a lone, towering inferno that erased the collective knowledge of antiquity and triggered the onset of the Dark Ages. Modern historical analysis reveals this image as a fabrication. At its height, the library was a state-funded research apparatus. The Ptolemaic kings offered tax exemptions, free lodging, and generous stipends to centralize the world's most elite minds within a single, massive campus. The institution's collapse was a centuries-long process of political interference, shifting priorities, and the eventual withdrawal of imperial support. Examining the specific timeline of Alexandria's various crises identifies the actual systemic forces that allow human knowledge to vanish. The first significant erosion occurred in 145 BCE. King Ptolemy VIII Physcon launched a violent political purge of the Alexandrian elite, targeting the scholars who had supported his dynastic rivals. Leading intellectuals, including the head librarian, were forced into exile. This diaspora dispersed Hellenistic scholarship across the Mediterranean, leaving the library's prestigious chairs filled by political flunkies rather than researchers. 40 years after the purge, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and became the first figure traditionally blamed for the library's destruction. Besieged in the city's harbor in 48 BCE, Caesar ordered his troops to set fire to his own fleet to block the advancing Egyptian forces. The fire jumped from the ships to the docks. Historical accounts suggest the heat destroyed roughly 40,000 scrolls, but these were largely stored in seaside warehouses waiting for export or cataloging. The library itself stood further inland in the royal quarter. Built primarily of stone and tile, the main facility remained intact after the dockyards cooled. While the loss of 40,000 scrolls was a significant blow, the core collection and the institution of the Mausian survived the Caesarean fire. The physical demise of the library's home followed the imperial crises of the 3rd century CE. Alexandria was caught in a brutal tug-of-war between the forces of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra and the Roman Emperor Aurelian. In 272 CE, Aurelian's forces razed the Brucheian royal quarter to the ground. The palace complex and any remaining library infrastructure within it was obliterated as collateral damage of total war. By this point, the primary repository of books had shifted to the Serapeum Temple, a smaller daughter library on the city's outskirts. In 391 CE, this site became the focus of the next major historical accusation, involving a Christian mob and Bishop Theophilus. The mob successfully demolished the Serapeum Temple under imperial decree, but eyewitness accounts from the preceding years describe the library chests as already empty. The collection had been looted or sold off long before the rioters arrived. The 415 CE murder of Hypatia, a renowned philosopher and mathematician, is often linked to the library's end. Records from the time clarify that Hypatia was a victim of a localized political feud between the bishop and the governor. Her death symbolized the end of classical philosophy in the city, but the Great Library had been gone for over a century. Military conquest and urban riots only finished what decades of dwindling membership and stalled funding had already started.
The final narrative of destruction involves the Arab conquest of 642 CE. Legend claims Caliph Omar ordered the library's scrolls burned to fuel the city's bathhouse furnaces for 6 months. This account first appeared in the 13th century, more than 600 years after the event it describes. During that period, the Muslim leader Saladin faced massive campaign debts and was forced to liquidate the state's Islamic libraries to pay his soldiers. Saladin's supporters publicized the myth of Omar's fire as a historical precedent, making his forced liquidations appear normal. But when Arab armies arrived, the library was a distant memory. Its structural collapse had already occurred during the 3rd century Roman wars. The library vanished through the quiet erosion of its institutions. It was a victim of shifting imperial budgets and a society that slowly ceased to value the cost of its upkeep. History shows that knowledge is most vulnerable when it is neglected. Intellectual centers collapse when political instability makes their preservation an elected expense rather than a foundational priority.